The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the sharp bite of an early winter. Dust swirled in frantic spirals, stinging the eyes of a woman who knelt in the dirt, her hands clutching the hem of a tattered shawl. Her voice, raw and broken, barely rose above the gale as she whispered, "End it now, please." Her words weren't meant for the man standing before her, a rancher whose calloused hands gripped a rifle, his silhouette rigid against the bruised purple sky. They were a prayer, a plea to something greater, something that might finally silence the pain that had haunted her for years. The rancher, Amos Creed, froze, his finger hovering over the trigger, his weathered face a map of conflict. He wasn't a man of hesitation, but in that moment, time seemed to still, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for him to act. What he did next would change not just her life, but his own, in ways neither could have foreseen on that desolate stretch of frontier. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of a single moment to rewrite a life, please hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts for more stories that remind us of the good in the world. The woman's name was Clara Hensley, though she hadn't spoken her own name in months. It felt like a relic from a life that no longer belonged to her, a life before the fire that claimed her family, before the endless miles of walking, running, hiding. She was 32, but the weight of her grief made her seem older, her auburn hair streaked with premature gray, her green eyes dulled by a sorrow that seemed to have no bottom. Clara had been a schoolteacher once, in a small town called Willow Bend, where children laughed under her care, and her husband, Thomas, would meet her at the schoolhouse door each evening with a smile that made the world feel safe. That was before the raid, before the outlaws swept through, leaving nothing but ash and echoes. Clara had survived by chance, hidden in the root cellar while her home burned, while Thomas and their infant daughter, Lily, were taken from her forever. The memory of that night clung to her like damp cloth, chilling her even now as she knelt before Amos, her body trembling not from the cold but from the exhaustion of carrying a grief too heavy for one soul to bear. Amos Creed was no stranger to hardship. At 45, he was a man carved from the land itself, his broad shoulders stooped from years of wrestling cattle and mending fences under an unforgiving sun. His ranch, a sprawling spread called Ironwood, was his life's work, built from nothing but grit and stubborn will after he'd left behind a past he rarely spoke of, a past that involved a brother lost to violence and a promise to never let harm come to those under his care. Amos was known in the nearby town of Redstone as a man of few words but unyielding principle. He didn't trust easily, and he didn't meddle in others' affairs. Yet, when he'd found Clara stumbling across his land, half-starved and muttering to herself, something in him stirred. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of men broken by war, in the mirror after his brother's death. He'd brought her to the barn, given her a blanket and some broth, but when she'd bolted in the night, clutching a stolen knife, he'd tracked her down, not out of anger, but out of a quiet certainty that she wasn't running from him, but from something far worse. The challenge Clara faced was not just survival, though that alone was a battle. Her body was frail, her strength sapped by weeks of starvation and sleepless nights haunted by nightmares. But the true war was within her, a relentless struggle against the despair that whispered she was better off dead. Every step she took felt like a betrayal of Thomas and Lily, as if living was an insult to their memory. She'd wandered from town to town, avoiding the pitying stares of strangers, the whispers of "poor Clara," that followed her like a shadow. She'd taken to the wilds, hoping the vastness of the plains would swallow her whole, but instead, she'd found Amos's ranch, a place that seemed to demand she confront the very thing she'd been fleeing, the possibility of hope. When she'd stolen the knife, it wasn't to harm anyone but herself. She'd planned to end it that night, under the cold stars, where no one would find her. But Amos had found her, his horse's hooves thundering in the dark, his voice steady as he called her name. Now, as she knelt before him, begging for release, she wasn't asking for his bullet, she was asking for permission to let go, to stop fighting a battle she no longer believed she could win. Amos, for his part, was wrestling with his own demons. He'd seen death before, too much of it. His brother, Jacob, had died in a saloon brawl, a senseless fight over a card game that left Amos carrying a guilt he could never shake. He'd vowed then to protect what was his, to keep his corner of the world safe. But Clara wasn't his, not really. She was a stranger, a ghost who'd wandered onto his land, and yet her pain felt like a mirror to his own. He'd raised the rifle not to threaten her but to scare off a coyote that had been circling, drawn by her weakness. Now, with her plea hanging in the air, he felt the weight of a choice he wasn't prepared to make. To end her suffering as she asked would be a mercy in her eyes, but it would damn him. To force her to live, to drag her back to a world she'd rejected, felt like cruelty. His hands shook, not from the cold but from the realization that this moment was a reckoning, for her, for him, for the man he wanted to be. The wind died for a moment, and in that sudden silence, Amos lowered the rifle. He didn't speak, didn't trust his voice to carry the words he needed. Instead, he stepped forward, his boots crunching on the frozen ground, and extended a hand. Clara flinched, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, but she didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, that outstretched hand, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. She stared at it, her breath hitching, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than pain, a flicker of something warm, something alive. She took his hand, her fingers trembling, and he pulled her to her feet, steadying her when her legs buckled. He didn't ask her questions, didn't demand explanations. He simply led her back to the barn, where the glow of a lantern cast soft shadows on the hay-strewn floor. There, in the quiet, he gave her a blanket and a tin cup of coffee, its warmth seeping into her hands as she sat, silent but alive. The days that followed were a slow, tentative dance. Clara stayed in the barn, sleeping on a cot Amos had set up near the stove. He brought her meals, simple things, stew and cornbread, but more than she'd eaten in weeks. She didn't speak much, and he didn't push her. Instead, he worked nearby, mending harnesses or tending to the horses, his presence a steady anchor. Clara watched him, noting the way his hands moved with quiet competence, the way his eyes softened when he spoke to his old mare, Daisy. She began to see the ranch not as a place of exile but as a living thing, a patchwork of effort and care. The land was harsh, but it was honest, and in its rhythms, sunrise to sunset, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, she found a kind of solace. She started helping, small tasks at first, carrying water for the horses, sweeping the barn. Each act felt like a rebellion against the darkness that had claimed her, a tiny victory in a war she hadn't realized she was still fighting. Amos, too, was changing. He'd always been a solitary man, content with the company of his animals and the open sky. But Clara's presence, fragile as it was, stirred something in him. He found himself talking more, sharing stories of the ranch, of the time a calf got stuck in a mudhole or the winter he'd nearly lost everything to a blizzard. He didn't pry into her past, but he listened when she began to speak, her words halting at first, then steadier. She told him about Willow Bend, about Thomas's laugh, about Lily's tiny hands. Each memory was a wound, but speaking it aloud seemed to drain some of the poison. Amos didn't offer platitudes or try to fix her pain. He simply listened, and in his silence, she found a kind of permission to grieve, to feel without fear of judgment. The turning point came in the spring, when the plains bloomed with wildflowers, a riot of color against the endless brown. Clara had been at Ironwood for 3 months, her body stronger, her eyes brighter, though the sorrow still lingered. One morning, Amos asked her to help with a newborn calf, a scrawny thing whose mother had died in labor. The calf was weak, barely able to stand, and Amos showed Clara how to feed it from a bottle, his hands guiding hers with a gentleness that surprised her. Day after day, they tended the calf, which Clara named Violet for the flowers that dotted the fields. Watching Violet grow, her wobbly legs gaining strength, Clara felt something shift inside her. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was hope, a fragile, trembling thing, like a seedling pushing through cracked earth. She began to imagine a life beyond survival, a life where she could laugh again, where she could honor Thomas and Lily by living, not by dying. Amos watched her transformation with a quiet pride. He'd never been one for grand gestures, but he built a small room off the main house for Clara, a space of her own with a window that caught the morning light. He didn't ask her to stay, but he hoped she would. And Clara, for the first time in a long time, wanted to. The ranch had become a refuge, not just from the world but from the worst parts of herself. She wasn't healed. Grief, she knew, would always be a part of her, but she was learning to carry it differently, to let it coexist with the possibility of something new. Amos, too, found his own burdens lighter. Clara's presence had reminded him that he wasn't just a man of the land, but a man capable of connection, of second chances. The story of Clara and Amos spread quietly through Redstone, a tale of two broken souls who found each other in the vastness of the frontier. It wasn't a love story, not in the way the townsfolk imagined, but something deeper, a bond forged in shared silence, in the choice to keep going when giving up seemed easier. Clara stayed at Ironwood, teaching the children of nearby ranchers in a small schoolroom Amos built, her voice steady as she read to them, her heart slowly mending. Amos remained the same gruff rancher, but there was a softness to him now, a warmth that hadn't been there before. Together, they built something neither had expected, a life, imperfect but real, rooted in the land and in each other. If this story of Clara and Amos, of pain and redemption, of finding light in the darkest places, has touched your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that hope is possible, and subscribe to Gentle Hearts for more stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. And before you go, please leave a comment below, tell us what this story meant to you, or share a moment when kindness changed your life. Your words might just be the light someone else needs today.